Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank the organisers very much. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to present here, and I look forward to your comments. So this work is on infrastructure investments and the persistence of coastal cities. So by way of motivation, there has throughout history been a global propensity for human settlement to favour coastal regions. And there's a very long literature that documents the historical reasons for this in terms of for instance, advantages for natural transport, fertile soils offering advantages for agriculture, and so on. And if we look globally today, the 5-metre coastal zone, so this is the area contiguous to the coast at less than 5 metres elevation, contains more than 300 million people, which is more than 5% of the world's population in just 1% of its land. So if we look at the economic history of developed countries, this suggests that over time, secular trends such as structural change out of agriculture, development of the inland infrastructure network and so on, may start to erode the advantages of coastal proximity over time. And indeed, it's now widely accepted that environmental change is in fact likely to lead to significant costs of coastal proximity in the coming decades. So there are many-fold increases in the human and economic costs of coastal disasters projected over the next century or so. So in this context, the key question that this paper aims to address is, should infrastructure investments continue to be favouring coastal regions, given what we know about the changing fortunes of coasts? And in particular, if we look globally, we see that despite these trends, coasts still continue to attract a very large and oftentimes even a growing share of major types of infrastructure investment. So the focus of the paper today is going to be on roads, and looking globally, the density of major roads is double the global average in this low elevation coastal zone, and this has been increasing in recent decades. So my aim will be to consider whether this pattern is optimal given what we know about changing coastal fortunes. Despite the trends discussed on the previous slide, globally, we see that coasts continue to attract a very large share of major types of infrastructure investment, and indeed this has been growing in many cases in recent decades. So I use the example of roads, which is what I will consider in this paper, where the density of major roads in the low elevation coastal zone is double what it is, double what the global average is worldwide, and this has been increasing in recent years. So my aim is going to be to consider whether this is optimal given what we know about the changing fortunes of coasts. So the first step of this will be to develop a dynamic multi-region spatial equilibrium model, which I will then combine with georeferenced microdata from an illustrative country. So I will be focusing on road investments in Vietnam over 2000 to 2010, which was a period of really major investment in Vietnam's road infrastructure network. So I will then use the structure of the model to estimate the impacts of the realized road investments in Vietnam over this period, and then a series of counterfactual investments that could have been made with the same total investment amount, both with and without accounting for the effects of future environmental change. So my empirical setting, as I've mentioned, will be Vietnam. Vietnam is, in common with much of developing Asia in particular, a setting in which coasts play historically a very important role. So this is a historically agrarian economy with population and economic activity really focused in low-lying coastal and deltaic regions. But there has, since a wide-ranging series of economic reforms beginning in the late 80s, been a shift inland in the locus of economic activity. So this has accompanied drastic structural change out of agriculture and rapid development of the inland transport network, which has been accompanied by this shift inland and a commensurate decline in the population share of the coastal zone. Compounding this, coastal regions in this context are already highly geographically vulnerable and increasingly so. So Vietnam is among the top 5 countries worldwide projected to be affected by climate change, and to give some sense of the magnitude of that, a 1 meter rise in the sea level, which is well within the bounds of what we expect over the next century, would inundate about 5% of Vietnam's land area, obviously much more than that in low-lying regions. And yet we see that major types of spatial infrastructure investments continue to favor coastal regions. I will, as I said, be focusing on roads. This is a very large area of investment here as elsewhere. So investments in the road network reach more than 3.5% of GDP by the end of the period. And what I show in these maps is the road map at the beginning of my study period in 2000, the end of my study period in 2010. This was almost exclusively upgrading of the existing road network rather than construction of new roads. But what this map really illustrates is that the concentration of these upgrades was concentrated along Vietnam's eastern seacoast here, and then in the low-lying Red River and Mekong River Delta regions. And really the puzzle at the heart of this paper is the following, which is that the regions that saw the strongest concentrations of upgrades are exactly those regions that are projected to face permanent inundation of large areas over the coming century. So to investigate this, I will be using a dynamic spatial equilibrium model. In the interest of time, I am sadly not going to be able to talk through the details of the model, but I will try to talk through its key features and the reasons for those choices, and then discuss the kind of core ingredients of the model. So for the purposes of the questions that I'm trying to answer, the key features that I want the model to incorporate are the following. So I want, of course, to account for the fact that, as is well known, wet roads have general equilibrium effects and can lead to both reallocation and aggregate growth. So I will be using a spatial general equilibrium setup building on the work of Costas and others in this area. Importantly, of course, for this context, I want to account for the fact that coasts might just be different. So we expect that coasts might have, for instance, productivity advantages associated with fertile soils. The coasts might have particular amenity advantages, so people like living near coasts because of nice climates and nice views and so on. And of course, most certainly they have advantages in terms of trading links. So I will be using a multi-region economic geography model that allows for heterogeneity along each of these dimensions. Thirdly, this literature has focused on static setups. I here will be considering questions that are inherently dynamic in the sense that I want to account for the fact that roads will lead to gains today, but also tomorrow. But of course, also importantly, the set of changes in fundamentals that I will be thinking about in terms of future climate change will not be realized until future periods. So I will accommodate this using a dynamic setup that builds on the kind of pioneering approaches of Artuk et al. In their 2010 AER paper and Lorenzo Caliendo and others' more recent Econometrica paper. Finally, this is a setting where frictions are going to be very important, so my framework will incorporate imperfect mobility of both goods and workers. So at a very high level, the key ingredients of the model are going to be workers who are forward-looking and choose their consumption, both of consumption goods and residential land. And they're also going to be choosing their location of residence for the next period, given the realization of their preference shock. Firms are going to be monopolistically competitive. So this is following the canonical models of Helpman and others in this literature. I'm going to have increasing returns to scale rising from fixed costs in production. And at the heart of it, these optimization problems combined with market clearing conditions are going to lead to the three equilibrium conditions that define the equilibrium of the model. So this will be an expression for the expected lifetime utility of a representative agent in each location, and then a gravity equation for the flow of goods in each period and the flow of migrants between locations, between periods. So the setup of the model then will be as follows. There will be n locations indexed by I in discrete time periods that are each endowed with an innate productivity value A, an innate amenity value B, and a supply of residential land H. And then between each pair of locations, there will be a bilateral cost of trade D and a bilateral cost of migration mu. So to be transparent about what I will be playing with in the simulations here, there are going to be two things I will be altering. The first is considering the distribution of road upgrades made in this context, and that's going to manifest itself in the model through changes in the trade cost matrix D. The second is this dynamic effect of changes in the sea level over time. And that's going to show up in the model in two ways. Firstly, as the sea level rises, the land supply that is available in districts that see inundation will contract. And the second is that as roads become inundated with sea level rise, they will become more costly to traverse, and this will affect the trade cost matrix D. Again, I'm skipping, of course, several slides worth of model detail that I would love to discuss had I more time, but in essence, the key ways in which these are going to manifest themselves in terms of welfare is that road upgrades are going to affect welfare both through price effects, so improvements in the district's market access is going to reduce prices, increase wages, and affect welfare that way, but because of the influence on the agent's dynamic residential choice decision, there will also be this endogenous migration response that also affects welfare. And in terms of the sea level rise, there will be these, as I say, this will be realized in two ways in the model. So the first is that as land becomes inundated, this is going to reduce the land area available in inundated districts and push up rents. But there will be the second effect that as roads become inundated, they become more costly to traverse, and this is going to increase the costs of trading with those regions and affect welfare in that way as well. So in terms of the data that I use here, all of the analysis will be at the level of Vietnam's districts. So this is the second level administrative division in Vietnam. There are going to be 541 districts that are consistent over my study period. So I have geographic data from the Columbia Earth Sciences Network and the US Geological Survey, population data from the census. In terms of economic data, I have two sources of economic data at the district level. The formal sector wage has the advantage that it comes from a census. It has the significant shortcoming that the census only covers the formal sector. So everything I show you is robust to using either of these, but my preferred estimates are going to use expenditure per capita data from the Vietnam Household Living Standards Survey, which is a better measure of permanent income in this context. 5-year migration data from the census, and then transport data, which is going to be based on manually digitized data on the road network, the inland waterway network, and coastal shipping routes in Vietnam. So these are the predominant modes of transportation over this period. Rail utilization was very low, and it wasn't competitive over any haulage length during this time, so I will not incorporate that. I allow for different categories of road and waterway, and for road travel to be more or less costly on different slopes, and then assign to each stretch of these networks 3 types of costs. So a cost per kilometer, a time cost, and then a mobilization cost, which essentially accounts for the fact that coastal shipping is very cheap once you get going, but very expensive to start. The final point on data is road construction costs. So all of the counterfactuals I consider are going to be cost neutral, as determined by a cost function from the engineering literature that's been employed in other studies. So the first part of the analysis, which I will not talk about in detail at all today, I want to focus on the main structural estimation exercises, but in the first part of the analysis, I will use this data together with a segment of the upgraded network that has a predetermined historical origin to provide some reduced form evidence that is consistent with the predictions of the model. So in particular, I used the fact that over the study period, there was a 2,000 kilometer highway constructed along the route of the historical Vietnam War era Ho Chi Minh Trail to form the basis of an instrumental variable strategy, which allows me to look at the effects of market access in this setting. So my preferred IB estimates will suggest that a 1% increase in district level market access is going to be associated with about a 0.47% increase in local expenditure per capita, which is going to be consistent both with estimates from other contexts in the literature, but importantly, consistent with what the model would predict, which is somewhat reassuring about its predictions. But turning to the kind of the core structural estimation part of the paper, I will be using the model to consider this question of whether infrastructure investments should be continuing to favor coasts in four steps. The first of these is that I will need to choose values for 4 structural elasticities in the model. So these are going to be the housing share of consumption expenditure, the discount factor, the migration elasticity, and the elasticity of substitution between across goods. So I'm going to take these from the literature and, of course, test robustness to choosing alternative values and so on. But with values for these structural elasticities in hand and data on the observed values of the endogenous variables in an initial period, in 2010, I can then invert the model to find the district level market access and productivity values that are going to be consistent with the observed data being an equilibrium outcome of the model. I can then take those and the dynamic machinery of the model to simulate the model forward at 5 yearly intervals. So my migration data is 5-year migration rate. So I will be simulating forward at 5 yearly intervals to find the equilibrium path of the district level population and the district level wage as the economy converges towards a stationary equilibrium in which the values of all of the aggregate variables in the economy are constant. I will then, in the final stage of the estimation, re-simulate the model forward under a series of counterfactual scenarios. So this will be along 2 dimensions. The first is that I can estimate the effects of both the realized and then a series of counterfactual road upgrade investments. So I simulate the effects of the realized upgrades by simulating the effect of their removal, and then consider a series of alternative road investments that could have been made. I will talk about the selection of those counterfactuals shortly, and simulate the model forward to find the counterfactual welfare effects of those. And then the second thing is that I will run all of these simulations both with and without incorporating the effects of future sea level rise over the next 100 years. So this is going to be important as a key aim here is to understand how far incorporating the effects of future sea level rise impacts our estimates of the returns to these investments and our assessment of where we should be locating the road upgrades that are made. So the first of these steps, the calibration of district level market access and productivities, produces some maps that look like this. The left-hand panel is market access, the right-hand panel is productivities, and in both cases red indicates a higher value. So looking at these look somewhat sensible, as we would hope. We see high calibrated market access in those areas that have particularly dense road and inland waterway access or easy access to coastal shipping. Looking at the right-hand panel for calibrated productivities, for those of you who know the Vietnamese context, this sort of passes the eyeball test. So we see particularly high calibrated productivities in the Hanoi-Hai Phong corridor here and in the industrialized southeast, which are the sort of key economic engine regions of Vietnam. For those of you who don't, or who would prefer something a little more rigorous than the eyeball test, I can also correlate the calibrated productivity values with out of sample TFP data at the district level, and I find a positive correlation with the calibrated values. So that's reassuring that it's picking up something sensible. So I now turn to the simulations. The first exercise, as I say, is to simulate the effects of the realized road upgrades. This is by simulating the effects of their removal. The left-hand panel here shows this is the map you've seen before. This is what the road network actually looked like in 2010. The right-hand panel shows the implied distribution of road upgrades between 2000 and 2010 to reach that. And as you can see, as we saw in the earlier map, this is again very strongly concentrated in these coastal and deltaic regions. In terms of the counterfactual networks that I will be considering, they are, Costas, I'm seeing lots of orange pop-ups, which I'm just ignoring for now, but please do tell me if any of them I should be responding to before my time's up.
I don't see any. Yeah, I don't see some.
Okay, I just
see some in the chat, but I'll let you know if I see some.
Okay, fine. Okay, terrific. So the counterfactual networks that I will consider are going to be based on objective rules of thumb or metrics used by transport planners in other contexts. So I want to be clear that these are not model dependent counterfactuals. the idea is that these are sort of implementable rules with a direct interpretation for policymakers. The second thing I want to say before showing you what the counterfactual networks look like is that it is a result that all of these counterfactual allocations are going to be less coastally concentrated than the status quo. So in some cases, as you'll see, that's by construction. I constrain them to avoid the most vulnerable regions. In other cases, I don't constrain them such, and it will still be the case that they are less concentrated near coasts than the status quo, consistent with the realized allocation being particularly favoring coastal regions particularly. So the first counterfactual I consider is a very simple rule of thumb that has formed the basis of allocation rules in other contexts, so Brazil and China and so on, which is simply to connect major administrative divisions. So I find the least cost path between all province capitals, upgrade that to a dual carriageway, that would give a road network that looks like this. The implied distribution of upgrades looks like this, and of course this is much more evenly distributed across the country than the realized upgrades. The second counterfactual tries to do a bit better than this, and this counterfactual aims to maximize market potential, by which I mean I rank all pairs of districts in Vietnam according to their market potential, so the sum of their populations divided by the Euclidean distance between them, and go down that list allocating one category upgrades until I run out of money, where the amount of money I have is the total amount that was spent on the realized upgrades. And that would result in a distribution of upgrades that looks like the following. This, of course, necessarily is quite concentrated in those regions that are densely populated by construction, and those regions that are densely populated are somewhat concentrated in coastal and deltaic regions. But again, this allocation is less coastally concentrated than the status quo. The final two counterfactuals do exactly this exercise, so try to maximize market potential, but amongst a specific subset of districts that are less subject to the effects of future inundation. So the first of them maximizes market potential outside the entire 5-meter low elevation coastal zone. That would imply a distribution of upgrades that looks like this. Of course, this is much more strongly concentrated at higher elevations. And the final counterfactual does this exercise, but maximizing market potential only amongst the subset of districts that lie outside the 1-meter coastal zone projected to face permanent inundation over the next century. So turning to some results, the simulations, firstly, I will show the results in the central scenario. So this is what we think is actually going to happen, which is a 1-meter rise in the sea level realized gradually over the next 100 years. So I will implement this in the model as a rise in the sea level each period incrementally every 5 years, such that by 100 years time, all land at less than 1-meter elevation is inundated, and all roads, as are all roads that lie below 1 meter's elevation. So in this central scenario, the results suggest that the net present value of aggregate welfare is 1.75% higher as a result of the road upgrades that were actually made in this setting, relative to the case in which no upgrades have been made. This outperforms the simple rule of thumb that simply connects all provinces, but the market potential maximizing allocation the estimates suggest would have led to much higher aggregate welfare gains. So this suggests that an allocation that doesn't specifically try to avoid coastal regions, but nonetheless is much less strongly concentrated near coasts, would have achieved welfare gains more than 50% higher. So in thinking about whether these constrained market potential maximizing allocations should imply welfare gains that are higher or lower than this, there are these two sort of offsetting forces. The first of which is that these, that's fine, thank you. The first of which is that these constrained allocations are much less strongly concentrated in those regions that are projected to face inundation. And so we will see a lower share of these allocations being lost to inundation, which should imply higher welfare gains. But set against this, of course, these are foregoing market access, the gains to market access improvements in the near term to those regions that are very densely populated at low elevations and so on. The simulation results suggest that the latter effect is going to dominate in the case of the 5-meter zone, but that it is the market potential maximizing allocation that avoids the most vulnerable regions at less than 1 meter elevation that are subject to permanent inundation within 100 years that would have achieved the highest gains. So this graph shows the same information, but relative to the welfare gains implied for the status quo. And again, it's the foresighted allocation of avoiding the most vulnerable regions that the simulations suggest have the highest welfare gains, with welfare gains 72% higher than those achieved by the status quo. The second set of simulations sort of makes the observation that these implied unrealized gains potentially a combination of two factors. The first of which, as I've discussed at length now, is that these counterfactuals are all less strongly concentrated in areas that will face inundation, which implies that in a scenario where I'm incorporating the effects of future inundation, they should have this effect should be increasing their relative welfare gains. But it is, of course, possible that there are entirely orthogonal sources of misallocation in the realized network, and it might indeed be the case that even in the absence of a projected sea level rise, there would have been higher gains to market access improvements elsewhere. And so I re-simulate all the results in a scenario in which there is no future sea level rise. And the results of that exercise are the following. Of course, sort of somewhat trivially, in this case, it's the unconstrained market potential maximizing allocation that achieves the highest gains. In this scenario, with no sea level rise, the constraint to avoid inundated regions is irrelevant because inundation is shut down in the model. But the two key takeaways here are firstly, that even in the absence of environmental change, there look to be significant unrealized welfare gains to counterfactual allocations of these upgrades that are concentrated further inland. So this is consistent with infrastructure allocations being slow to respond to the changing pattern of coastal advantage, even before we account for the effects of environmental change that are projected to be realized over the coming decade. But the second key finding here is of course that accounting for the effects of future environmental change leads to these very large jumps in the unrealized welfare gains from more foresighted allocations, particularly those that avoid the most vulnerable regions. So I'm just about at time, I think, but I just want to sort of mention briefly, though I won't have time to discuss them, that to the extent that coasts have particular advantages for international trade, particularly amenity advantages and so on, the model's already incorporating that to the extent those remain the same over time. There are a series of potential explanations that might help to rationalize the observed coastal favoritism if we expect that those factors might increase in importance over time. And the central estimates do not incorporate that. So I conduct a series of alternative exercises where I allow for pretty extreme assumptions about continued growth in international exports, or increasing weight being put on the coastal amenity premium towards developed country levels as Vietnam develops over time, or indeed secular changes in productivities across districts that I simply take from the observed change in district level productivities from 2000 to 2010. And none of these are going to be sufficient to rationalize the observed degree of coastal favoritism. So I'm at time, but just to conclude, the results of the paper suggest that a reversal in the fortune of coastal regions that is reinforced by environmental change can have important implications for where we should allocate infrastructure today. I find that even before we start to account for the effects of future sea level rise, there are significant unrealized gains to allocations concentrated further inland, but that allowing for future climate change strongly accentuates the gains from avoiding the most vulnerable regions. And I just end on this really enormous number of people that currently live on land that will be below sea level or chronic flood levels by the end of the century, highlighting that consideration of these factors might be increasingly important as we think about where to allocate major types of infrastructure investments today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was very interesting and fortunately or unfortunately, not couldn't be more timely given what's happening in California, which kind of, you know, another aspect of what you can apply your work on. Before I kind of give the like your chance to answer some questions, let me ask two clarifying questions, one coming from me and one from Richard, and then Richard can follow up, that maybe will help people think later on. So I didn't exactly understand how you solve for the optimal market access. Do you, like, two things is like, is it an algorithm that gives you the unique kind of, you know, determined optimal market access, and what do you do with like the zeros? Like, do you create new roads? So that's the one question. Let me ask you also, Richard, and then you can ask.
I see the depreciation question. Yep.
Yeah, and then the depreciation on infrastructure. Okay. Yeah.
Terrific. Yeah. So thank you. Yes, really important question. So on your point on the zeros, I follow the what they did essentially. So over the study period, there is a 0.6% increase in the length of the road network. So it's essentially all increased upgrades of existing roads. So all of what I implement will be only improvements of existing roads and not construction of brand new links. On the question of the optimal, yes, a great question that is currently top of my mind. At the moment, I do not claim to be estimating the optimal network. So I use this market potential maximizing allocation, and then consider this kind of somewhat orthogonal question of how relative to that benchmark accounting for inundation affects the returns to that. There is, of course, both in your
Claire, we lost you, unfortunately.
Your work with Treb,
Claire,
and the big...
We lost you for 15 seconds. We lost you. Maybe you can...
I apologize.
The optimal.
I'm so sorry for this.
Yes, not problem.
Yes, on the question of the, so that's, I hope you heard the answer about the zeros. On the question of the optimal, I do, at the moment, I'm focusing on this, the market potential with and without accounting for the inundation effects as my benchmark, but I am right in the process of considering how I can incorporate the techniques pioneered both in your work with Treb and in the Feigelbaum and Schall exercise to get at something closer to an optimal. Of course, this is in a dynamic setup, so it's not quite the same. But thinking about other counterfactuals, I might consider in this context. On the point about depreciation, this is a really important point. The central estimates, the estimates that I showed you in the slides, assume that there was this period of really major investment in Vietnam's road network between 2000 and 2010, and in every period thereafter, the government chooses to maintain all roads equally. So there are, of course, infinite permutations of how the government might choose to differentially maintain or upgrade thereafter. And to sort of investigate that, I conduct a robustness check where I allow for only those road upgrades made between 2000 and 2010 to depreciate over the natural lifespan of these types of roads, which is about 30 years. So I conduct a robustness where only those investments made over 2000 to 2010 depreciate, and all other roads are maintained equally thereafter. That's going to attenuate some of the differences between the counterfactuals somewhat, because the investments matter less, but it isn't going to overturn those two central findings that there's an inefficient degree of coastal favoritism with or without inundation, and that accounting for inundation is going to strongly accentuate the gains to the foresighted allocation. That's going to be robust even with this quite extreme assumption about depreciation.
Okay, great. I think you answered Richard's question, but if you want, you can unmute to clarify. If not, there are two more questions by Fabrizio and Luis Felipe. Fabrizio, do you want to?
Yeah, so just a reflection on two related things. So first, you emphasize the average welfare gain. Now, in the context of this situation where you may have disasters, one might want to go beyond some utilitarian principle and start thinking about the exposed realization under a catastrophe scenario, let's say for the 20% most exposed people. And I was wondering, incidentally, you may have said, and I apologize, so if you calculate, with this calculation, taking into some account the cost of relief in case of disasters, and again, this doesn't completely rule out the first part of the question, because you may still have in mind that you want somehow to protect the most vulnerable part of the population.
Yeah, no, thank you. So this is again really important. I have focused in the results to date indeed on this sort of average welfare effects. It's absolutely right that one might want to think about specifying kind of alternative objective functions there. So I present in the paper the kind of the distribution of welfare gains implied under each scenario, but I haven't sort of taken this as far as under different scenarios as to what the weights one might put on different groups or different areas in the objective function. How far could one rationalize an allocation like this? So that's not an exercise I've done, but is certainly a really interesting area to think about. On the point about the cost of catastrophe, I have tried in what I've done in the central estimates to be quite sort of conservative, in that this is incorporating only those effects of projected environmental change over the next century about which there is some degree of consensus and forecastability. Even then, of course, it's hugely controversial, but to incorporate the effects of gradual inundation only. There are manifold other projected effects of environmental change, which are much more difficult to quantify. I'm currently working on a sort of a robustness that accounts for some of the more difficult to project, but most certainly important effects, including the increased prevalence of high intensity typhoons, saltwater intrusion, land subsidence, and so on, and thinking about how one can incorporate the kind of probabilistic changes in those events. They're going to, of course, they're going to amplify the effects, but I haven't yet got results from all of those simulations.
Okay, thanks. Maybe Luis Felipe, you can ask one more question, and I don't know if we'll have time for Doug. Doug has another question following up on Richard. If we don't have time, then you can follow up in the chat. Luis Felipe, can you unmute?
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting paper. I just have a question about your results in light of some economic activities that are producing value chains. I just put the example of coffee. If you think about for coffee, it's critical to have ports, and the investments in the coast are as important as every other investment in the value chain, although it is part of agriculture because it's produced inland, and part of the roasting and all this value added also takes place in cities. So I'm just concerned a little bit about the policy implication of redirect investment, say outside ports, and redirect the connectivity outside the ports. And how can that, you think, affect actually inland activities that do demand the development of coasts? Especially, I mean, I just mentioned coffee. Vietnam nowadays is the second world producer of coffee, and it's a big deal there.
Yeah, no, thanks. Another great point. So I mean, a few things to say on that. The first is that no road's ever going to get cut off. It's going to become more costly to traverse, but there's no question of cutting off any ports in any of the simulations. The model, in a way that sadly I didn't have time to describe, it is going to incorporate the importance of international market access. So the kind of value attached to the cost of reaching a port from which one can trade internationally is incorporated explicitly in the model and estimated in the data. To the extent this varies with sectoral composition across space and so on, I'm constrained. The model has a single sector. I'm constrained by data availability here. Certainly at the district level, it's very difficult to do that. I am currently in the process, I think at the province level, I can do a bit better with this. And I've just obtained some province level data by sector that may allow me to get at those effects. It's going to be much less granular. There are 60 provinces instead of 540, but I'm hoping to try and look into that in more detail, at least at the province level. Thanks, that's great. Great suggestion.
Okay, maybe Doug can ask his question too, and maybe can give a quick answer. Doug, can you?
Okay, thanks, and thanks, Claire. This is great and really interesting work. My question may not have an easy answer, but it's really kind of in a context like this where we're getting over time a steady flow of new information about climate and climate change and the extent, and particularly the local and the detailed local impacts. And we're also, at the same time, because of the new information, we're improving the models. And it seems like this creates lots of reasons to want to defer big investments until the information and the modeling is clearer. So I'm kind of thinking in terms of the dynamics of the investment portfolio.
Yeah, really interesting. And it's something I've shut down to the extent that I have considered a fixed investment amount made over this period and how that can be allocated. There's certainly an additional question of the optimality of the dynamic distribution, which I haven't investigated at all, but I think would be a really interesting one to look at. And there's no reason that the model can certainly accommodate that. So that's really interesting. I mean, notwithstanding questions of changes in the cost of investment and so on. The one point I would make on the changing predictions, which you're absolutely right, they changed hugely even over the course of the time I've been working on this project. The one thing I would say on that is that they're all moving in one direction, and so as every new iteration of these projections comes out, it makes my results look more and more conservative. But absolutely, there's certainly scope to think about the dynamics of the investment decision, not just the allocation of a fixed investment amount in a given time period, that I think is really interesting. So thank you.